As though there wasn't enough problems in the Russia-Ukraine war, as we're trying desperately to get to a position with the emergence of the Trump administration to try and get a negotiated settlement in the war, in the risk of escalation with the current administration allowing long-range strikes by American weapons and British and French weapons into the Russian mainland and the heartland, which we're dealing with the possibilities of escalating there. Now then, we have just in the last 36 hours or 24 hours, I guess, as an attempt on, not an attempt, an execution and an assassination of a Russian general in Moscow by the Ukrainian side, which unusually they have taken credit for it, and they didn't deny it at all. Said it was supposed to send a message to Russia. We're going to get to what that message may have been intended, and we'll see how that worked out. But there's been some additional information and the developments of where and how this war is going to be settled anyway between the primary people, and that is between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And to try and to make sense of all this and to see, kind of read between the lines about what's really going on here, we have back with us today Colonel Douglas Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, highly decorated combat veteran, and just all-around great guy. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Dan.
Always appreciate having you here on this because you were so tied into what's going on, and there's probably not a better analyst of combat, because given that you've led troops in high intensity combat in the past and trained a lot of other troops to do the same thing. So it's always great to have you on. And let's just jump right into this. First of all, we keep talking about that things could radically change on January 20th when the Trump administration is inaugurated into power. And I want to show folks a little bit about Trump's thinking, because sometimes we only think about things, at least in the media, in the Western media, about the strategic calculus and, what's good for this side or that side. But Trump is showing his humanity side too, that one of the things that's actually motivating him on wanting to reach this end. And one of the first things he said in a speech, I guess it was a couple of days ago, he explained why he wants to end the war.
Everyone's being killed. It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II. I've had pictures of fields where bodies are lying on top of bodies. Looks like the old pictures of the Civil War, where just bodies are all over. Just if you saw those pictures, you'd feel more strongly about it. It's got to stop.
So it's not just about the deal or what he can strike, but he seems genuinely motivated by the huge number of people that are dying in this.
Well, the good thing is you're not going to hear a stupid statement from President Trump like the ones we've gotten from people like Lindsey Graham, who talk about why we should celebrate the deaths of Russians. Perhaps at some point, the true figures will also be revealed to President Trump, because the Ukrainians have taken losses at a rate of about 6 to 7 for every one Russian soldier that was lost. So these numbers are outrageous, and these piles of dead that he's pointing to are overwhelmingly Ukrainian.
And when you're talking about what you want to do and why you want to bring something to an end, it just seems to me that there's insufficiently small recognition of the profound price that's being paid by the Ukrainian people. And so many people, like the Lindsey Grahams, like the Jack Keanes, like the General Hodges, they almost seem oblivious to this. I remember some really painful stories from earlier this year when Lindsey Graham went to Ukraine and was, cheerleading them on and saying, yeah, bring more troops in, lower the recruiting age. Apparently, some in the current administration are still trying to pressure Kiev into doing that, oblivious to the cost to them and what this is going to mean going forward. Why do you suppose we don't care anything at all, at least on the official level, about the casualties on the Ukraine side?
Well, Zelensky's meat grinder seems to appeal to a lot of people in Washington, who obviously have no sense whatsoever of what's happening on the battlefield. They don't understand the suffering in war. They don't understand that once you have an advantage over your enemy, which is what the Russians have had for some time now, but particularly at the end, when the front collapses and people are running for their lives, there's no sense of just how much damage you can do at that point. And the Russians have I think on more than one occasion exercised a remarkable restraint, but then they've been compelled for obvious reasons to destroy what's in front of them. I mean, it's a tough position. You'll remember when I came to you after we had blasted through the Republican Guard rear detachment, a couple of things came up. One was that I called for a ceasefire, and a number of people were angry with me because they thought we should just annihilate what was left out in front of us. And there wasn't much there, as you know, Dan. And I said, no, we didn't come here to exterminate people. We didn't come here to exterminate the Iraqi military or anything else. We came here. We've won a battle. Now we need to give the people that are still alive a chance to surrender. You'll remember that.
I do.
But then afterwards, once they did surrender, I also made it clear that we were going to wipe out whatever was still out there. And that's what you put together, the Armageddon strike that we launched from the artillery, because we weren't allowed to advance. But the bottom line is that, this is not a ruthless war of extermination on the Russian side. And the Russians have never wanted that. But sadly, I think there's a lot of evidence that the Ukrainians have taken that position, and we take that position, and we simply do not care what happens to the Ukrainians. They are cannon fodder for the United States, I'm afraid.
And so now then we see, as a result of the significant loss of Ukrainian life, it's having the inexorable result on the battlefield. The only result it can be is the continued and now accelerating advance of the Russians to the west, now at the gates of Pokrovsk, Vasilivka, Novoselka, even in the Kursk area. They continue to shrink that incursion. Really everywhere on the battlefield, you see Russia continues to advance. And now at an accelerating rate. So that brings the question that Trump was also asking that press conference yesterday: are you going to, quote, give away land in exchange for peace? Here's what he said.
Do you believe that Ukraine should cede territory to Russia?
Well, I'm going to let you know that after I have my first meeting. But a lot of that territory, when you look at what's happened to those, I mean, there are cities that there's not a building standing. It's a demolition site. There's not a building standing. So people can't go back to those cities. There's nothing there. It's just rubble.
And I want to look at really at the premise of the question itself, because I hear it a lot. The impression that there's all this territory that we have in our hands, and we meaning the collective West and Ukraine, and that is Trump going to come in and just hand it over to Russia? I think that that's not the right discussion of even what's at stake here. And I'd like your view on that. The specific question is, does Trump have land to hand over to Ukraine, or is the Russians going to just take whatever they want on the battlefield, and that's just the reality?
Remember, there are preconditions to the talks from the Russian side. First and foremost, whoever comes to the talks, whether it is Donald Trump or his representatives, have to acknowledge that Ukraine will be neutral. There will be no joining of NATO now or ever. I think probably the Russians are less concerned about NATO the more they see of it, given how poorly the weapon systems have performed, and also the fact that, frankly, in Europe, there is absolutely no appetite whatsoever for war in Ukraine against Russia. But nevertheless, they're going to stand by that first requirement. Ukraine must be neutral. Secondly, that the legitimate control/ownership of the oblasts that have been seized inside Ukraine, which are populated by Russians, as well as Crimea, which already voted itself legally into Russia, these must be recognized as Russian territory. Now, those are the two basic requirements. If we're not willing to do that, it doesn't really make much difference what anyone says, because the Russians are not going to listen to us. I think that's very important. And the second thing, though, that I think that we need to keep in mind is solving the border issue is a matter for Russians and Ukrainians. I know that President Trump thinks of the United States as the great superpower that will come in and divide this child. And he'll sign off on whatever he thinks is appropriate. But the truth is, what we really need to do is simply suspend aid immediately, military aid to Ukraine, and withdraw all of our forces. And you'll have people around Trump say, oh, we can't do that. We're giving up a bargaining chip. Well, that's not really much of a bargaining chip, because as long as we persist in those areas, the Russians are going to move west. And there are talks right now inside the general staff that if a settlement is not reached along the lines that I just described, well, then they march west. And that means all the way to the Polish border and the Romanian border. If that's what we want, then by all means, continue to reject neutrality and the legitimate control of the territories in eastern Ukraine that are populated with Russians to Russia.
And do you think that they can actually make good on that? When you look at how long, for example, it's taken to get even up to Pokrovsk, how long it took to get Avdiivka, Vuhledar, et cetera, over a year in the case of Vuhledar, does Russia have the capacity to make good on that threat?
I think they can, absolutely, because there's nothing west of the Dnieper River to stop them. But is that something we even want to contemplate? It doesn't make any sense. And it's not something the Russians want, because they know the people living west of the Dnieper River are Ukrainians.
Right.
They don't want to rule Ukrainians. That's like, taking over a country whose entire population is hostile to you. And then you deal with all the consequences. But no, I think the Russians are quite serious. I think we have failed for the last 3 years, Dan, to take them seriously.
Yeah.
And we continue. I listened to someone earlier today talk about a statement from this former ambassador McFall suggesting that Ukraine can still win.
Oh my
Well,
God.
unless he's smoking crack, there's no excuse for a remarkably stupid comment like that. There is no chance whatsoever. Ukraine is destroyed. Can we rescue Ukraine as a nation state at all is the question now.
Yeah, and that still is very much up in grab, because I think, as you said, if we don't agree when the Trump administration comes in to those terms at the beginning, whether quickly or later, I think that Russia does have the capacity to do that, and we actually have looked at in recent episodes here at the defensive fortifications and why Pokrovsk is so important, because all of these defensive fortifications that have been chewed through, most of which were built in the 2014 and before period, and there's just not much on the other side of Pokrovsk that Russia has been chewing through, and it's entirely conceivable that they could make much more rapid progress on the other side of that if we keep going that far. But interesting, we a lot in the West love to characterize Vladimir Putin as Adolf Hitler, this purely evil person. He's used those terms in the West all the time about Putin. But when you listen to him talking about what the consequence for Ukraine is, it almost seems like he cares about the people.
If they reduce the mobilization age, lower the service age, it will not change the situation on the battlefield like it didn't for Hitler's Germany. But it will be one in a series of crimes they commit against their people. It doesn't protect the interests of the Ukrainian people. Such a decision would only protect the decisions of those who give decisions from abroad. That is the only motivation. Young boys will be herded and sent to be slaughtered. We saw how they are being caught in the streets like stray dogs and sent to face the bullets.
I think you've mentioned before that Putin, while he's against the government in Kiev, that he's not against the people in Ukraine. And as you have rightly pointed out many times, he's been very restrained when it comes to the damage he could have inflicted on the civil population throughout this war, and still has not done it, limiting his targets primarily to military installations or energy infrastructure, which is needed to maybe make their capability to conduct war continue on, to try to degrade that here. But one thing that in the U.S., one of many, I suppose, not only is Vladimir Putin Hitler, but also anything any Russian ever says is untrue. So just categorically just disbelieve anything. And the latest of that is Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, said overnight that he revealed, apparently for the first time, that he's actually put a number on it. He said the number of irretrievable losses for the Ukraine side is now over 1 million. That's killed and disabled to where they can no longer return to the battlefield. And that is a staggering number so far. And I just want to ask you, first of all, do you think that number is close to being right, or is it just Russian propaganda?
I think he's probably underestimating it. I think there are probably 1.4 to 1.5 million that fall into that category that you just described. President Trump talked about this is the worst we've seen since World War II, and he was correct in that sense. But this is more like a World War I battlefield. And again, we go back to this understanding that once you have networked, integrated all of the overhead surveillance, manned, unmanned, sensors from the ground all the way into space, with all of your strike systems, and the Russians historically have always had enormous numbers of strike systems. I'm talking about anything beyond line of sight. Once those are networked, you make it impossible for your enemy, unless the enemy has substantial air and missile defenses, to really move. It makes maneuver almost impossible. That's what the Russians have done in Ukraine. But you have to strip away that air and missile defense, which the Russians have done. We need to understand that. When that battlefield reveals itself and you don't have the capacity to defend yourselves against the air and missile threats that are multiplied by many, many times, 1,000 times what we've seen in the past, then you are in the position the Ukrainians are now. That means that your opponent can maneuver. Your opponent can appear wherever he likes. Your opponent can attack you wherever he likes, but you have no response. Because if you try to respond, if you leave your hole in the ground, or you leave wherever you are concealed, you're going to be destroyed. You know, the Russians, by the way, when Bonaparte faced the Russians finally in Russia itself, he was shocked that the Russians had more artillery than he did, because one of the secrets to his success was extraordinarily well-trained, accurate, and large quantities of artillery. So this is an age-old Russian plus. And that's also what the Germans and their allies found in Russia as the war dragged on. So that's no mystery. And that's not going to change. So hopefully, you know, people will listen to President Trump and understand just how terrible the lethality of this battlefield is. But I don't think they will. I think this is going to go on and on and on until 20 January. And then the real question is, can he rein in this rogue deep state, which consists largely of the intelligence communities and their supporters, and especially on the Hill? Can he rein it in? If he can't rein it in, can he break it and make it responsive to national command authority? I don't know.
Yeah, and man, almost as if right on cue, that was actually where we were going to go next in this, because in light of all the things that you just said there, we have to assume, and I think it's a safe assumption, that behind the headlines and behind the public statements, that whether in the Pentagon or whether in Whitehall or in the halls of power in France, that they're aware of what's actually going on the ground. They can see things. They're aware of these. They know that whatever the real number of Ukraine losses are, I mean, they have to know all that. So they have to know, just no matter what they want to say or what they wish would happen, that there are constraints and limitations physically on the battlefield. And yet, here we have Keir Starmer just yesterday addressing the war in Ukraine, almost completely oblivious to what you just said. But here's the important thing. It's not just his words, but his actions that go along with them.
Absolutely right to say it's a critical period for Ukraine. And I've been here with key NATO allies this morning having a discussion about Ukraine. We're on HMS Iron Duke here, which is in Estonia. We've got troops up the road who are integrated as part of our NATO response. The collective view is very clear. We must put Ukraine in the strongest possible position. That means we've got to make sure they have the capability they need, the training they need, the funding that they need, and we must support Ukraine in what they're doing. This is an act of aggression by Russia that's been going on for a very, very long time, so we must stand with Ukraine at this critical period.
Are you comfortable with the assassination, though?
Well, as I say, we must stand with Ukraine. I think that's a developing situation, but this morning's discussion was very clear about the strategic need.
So he referenced there, he was asked about the assassination of the Russian general. We're going to get to that in just a second. But let me stick with that first part there, because he mentioned that he was at a NATO meeting where he's talking about this continuing on, and we have to keep going on. But everybody knows, even if you ignore the battlefield, that Donald Trump's coming in unequivocally and emphatically saying, as we just showed from yesterday, we're going to find a negotiated settlement. So then why would the NATO and Western countries continue with this fiction as though Joe Biden is going to continue to be president? How does that work?
Well, the governments that we're discussing, like Keir Starmer's government or Olaf Scholz's government and Macron's government, are all in the hands of globalists that are committed to the open-ended, relentless war against Russia for all the reasons that we've discussed in the past. Russia presents an obstacle to the globalists that they can't get past. Russia is a national state. It has a culture that rests on the foundation of Orthodox Christianity. You begin to look at these things carefully, and clearly Russia has to be destroyed. Because what have all of these people done? Starmer is trying to destroy his own country. He's trying to accelerate immigration into the country, involving millions of people who are non-Europeans with the goal of destroying his own population. We've seen this unfold in Ireland. It's unfolding in Germany, in France, to a lesser extent in Spain, and to some extent in Italy. These governments are not going to last. Right now, Meloni can survive. There's no question about that in Italy, because she's diverged sharply from that path. But everybody else in Berlin, Paris, and London, they're scheduled for extinction. They're not going to last, Dan, and they know that. So I wouldn't put too much store in what they are saying, but I think it's another reflection of just how powerful this unelected deep state is, and the fact that it reaches over national borders into countries like Germany, France, and Great Britain.
Okay, but let's accept that they think that way, et cetera. But there's still the practical matter, and this is the part that I just don't understand. And maybe you could help illuminate this a little bit. You may want that outcome, but you know that somebody's about to come in that's going to change it diplomatically, and you see on the battlefield it will not go the way you want. So where is the value in having the fiction to go up in for another month or so?
Well, if you're familiar with Noam Chomsky's Manufactured Consent, and you also are familiar with Leon Trotsky and his activity as a Bolshevik, Trotsky's quip to one of his Bolshevik lieutenants who said, "Comrade, we can't possibly say this. It's not true." And he looked at him and he said, "Comrade, paper will put up with anything you put on it." Well, we've learned that the radio, television, internet, all of these things will put up with whatever you put on it. And sadly, large numbers of people will believe it, particularly if you keep saying it over and over and over again. So, this is going to go on until it is unambiguously clear that everyone's being lied to. Things are not turning out as anticipated, and they will not continue. Now, I think that's already begun a little bit in Germany, although I think the new chancellor, this Christian Democrat, is making stupid statements about Russia. That's not going to go down well with the public, not because they love Russians, but because nobody there is interested in going to war with Russia. I saw a poll today in Poland that suggested 55% of the adult population wants nothing to do with the war against Russia. These things are facts, and at some point, facts are hard to avoid, and they're insurmountable. So I wouldn't pay too much attention to them. In this sense, President Trump is on the right side of history. I just hope that he doesn't have unrealistic expectations of what he can impose. Impose is important on so-called on the Russians or Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine, because I don't think he can do that.
Okay, let's look at the other part of what Starmer said there. He was asked, and it was interesting as he was asked about the assassination of the Russian general, is that it apparently caught him off guard. I don't know how it would have. And he was like trying to figure out how he can say something without saying anything. And that's exactly what he said. Well, we'll have to figure that out later. Anyway, back to what I was saying here. But what do you make of this assassination attempt? Because this also fits in the pattern of nobody knows that the war can't be won more than the Ukrainian people behind the scenes and off camera. And yet they're not only have been trying to get this long range weapon systems used by the United States and France and Britain, to hit targets in Russia. And then this most recent attempt at a provocation to assassinate somebody in Russia. And according to the Wall Street Journal this morning, that's supposed to send a message to Russia. That's supposed to make them quake that nobody is safe, etc. What do you make of the real intent behind this?
Well, we have to know a little bit more about General Kirillov, and I did not. And for the last 24 to 36 hours, I've been digging, and several of my sources have finally come forward and explained the rationale behind this assassination. At the start of the special military operation, General Kirillov was adamant that the various biolabs inside Ukraine that we had helped set up and finance be seized as soon as possible. Now, there were a total in Ukraine of 46 biolabs that the Russians eventually found. These biolabs were engaged in developing bioweapons. They were looking at DNA and genetics to try and formulate a weapon that could be used against Russia that would kill only Russians. Now, I don't know how far they got, because if you look at Ukrainian DNA, which is different from Russian DNA, it's not radically different, but there are differences. If you look at that and then you look at Russian DNA, I don't know how they would have managed to avoid killing large numbers of Ukrainians. But then again, given the acute lack of interest in humanity in Washington, it may not have mattered to the people that were behind this. But he was the first to say, we've got to get into those biolabs, find out what they were doing. And I'm only talking about one aspect of the horrific things being done in those laboratories, where they found body parts that had been removed and were going to be resold, and a number of experiments that I don't want to go into. But the point is, there were 46 of them. And ultimately, the Russians, once they found out what they hoped was not true, they then destroyed these. They've obviously held on to much of the evidence. And a lot of this evidence leads back on a trail all the way to Washington, D.C., and some key political figures who have a hand in this and have actually invested in it. It's pretty frightening. In addition, he also identified the Kharkov Institute, which was the one place in Ukraine that was capable of developing a nuclear weapon. Now, how much Ukrainians were able to rescue from Kharkov before it was overrun by the Russians, but the Russians did get into it. They did get to the Kharkov Institute, and they discovered that there were efforts underway to create a suitcase nuclear weapon. We've heard lots about this in the media. Apparently, that was actually underway. Kirillov was behind all of the discoveries. He was the one who was tracking closely with Russian intelligence what we and the Ukrainians were doing in Ukraine. The military ultimately went in, at first was skeptical, but then when they began to discover the accuracy of his assertions, they went into all of them. And they've eliminated the labs, and they have shut down this thing in Kharkov Institute. But when you understand that, then you can understand why this criminal Ukrainian state, this organized crime state we pretend is a democracy or some other nonsensical thing, wants to kill the man, because he revealed what they were up to. And that's something they didn't want anyone to discover.
And we've talked about that. I think just yesterday on our show, we showed the headline from online right now at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA, I think they call it, where we admit there were 46 labs in the that the United States had funded. It's in. So this is not conspiracy theory kind of stuff. They, in fact, we still to this day admit, yeah, the stuff was there. And then they tried to shift it away and say, but, it was just a Russian propaganda misinformation campaign, because really everything was really cool. Now, there's out today an additional, or maybe it was yesterday, from the UK. Michael Clark went on Sky News to try and explain a different reason why Kirill may have been taken out.
Kirillov was in charge of CBN, chemical, biological, nuclear, by which we mean radiological. And he was in charge of the protection of Russian troops from those elements, chemical, biological, radiological. But his role went far beyond that. His actual behavior was that he was involved in the planning of chemical warfare in Syria. And he's had a great deal to do, and that's what the British government think, with chemical warfare all the way around the front in Ukraine. The K-51 gas grenade, a grenade that carries CS gas, but in some cases in lethal concentrations, is ubiquitous all along the front. It's used all the time. And there have been traces of sarin and cyanide in a number of chemical attacks. The Ukrainians have said that about 5,000 attacks have taken place. Western analysts say that might be a slight exaggeration, but the number is more or less credible.
It just seems a little bit unusual and skeptical when you're going to claim that there have been 5,000. There's that Ditra headline that Gary was showing yesterday, that there are 5,000 chemical weapon strikes used by Russia. We've never heard about it until after this assassination. What do you make of this charge?
Well, first of all, I think we've learned by now not to believe much that the Ukrainians say. I mean, we're back to the ghost of Kiev. And I think the Russians have been extraordinarily careful. Putin certainly has. I see no evidence for what they're arguing. Now, could someone have done something somewhere along the, 800-mile front? I have no idea. But I think that Ukrainian assertion is ridiculous. I think, on the other hand, what I've told you is quite true. And this is an old Bolshevik trick. If you are doing something that is horrific and heinous, accuse your opponent of doing it and use that as the justification for what you're doing. That's an old Bolshevik approach. It's nothing new in any of that. So I would take this with a grain of salt and go back to the original assertion. Were there any biolabs being established along the border of Ukraine by Russians for use against Ukrainians? Answer, no. Well, then why would the Russians then suddenly turn to the use of chemical or biological weapons against Ukrainians? They haven't. And that's not the sort of thing that the Russians are going to do in proximity to their own territory.
Yeah.
But this is a mountain of lies that's being built. And the mountain has to be dismantled. It will be, but not quickly. Now, I also noted something else. He talked about Syria. And you and I have exchanged comments on this. You know Ted Postel. And we know what a number of British observers have said, that MI6 staged 2 false flag events, both of which attracted missiles that were fired at Syria at President Trump's insistence. President Trump needs to understand that he hasn't had much truth from anybody in the intelligence community. He hasn't had much truth from anybody at the top of the Department of Defense. If he doesn't have truth tellers there, he's in a lot of trouble, because the people that are at the top of those organizations have a lot of people under them that are not telling them the truth. So we don't know what's going to happen after 20 January. I have always said, and I repeat this with all sincerity, Donald Trump is a man of good intentions and he is sincere, but he is frequently misinformed or simply lied to, boldface, lie. And that's a problem that exists now, and it's going to exist in the future. He's going to have to deal with that. And I hope that the people he's appointed are going to be able to tell him the truth.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I'm really hopeful that Tulsi Gabbard gets that DNI position, because that will put somebody that's willing to tell the truth in a key position. We'll have to see if that works out there too.
Well, I think it's important that you mention that, because no one on the Hill has raised objections to this Ratcliffe individual who they're going to put in charge of the CIA because he's one of their own. Tulsi Gabbard isn't, and they're doing everything in their power to destroy her before she ever gets to the hearing. And I'm sure they'll take every opportunity to destroy her at the hearing, because she's inclined, God forbid, to tell the truth.
Right.
And we need a good dose of truth. We haven't had much truth for the last 30 years.
Indeed, we have not. And that's one of the reasons I'm so hopeful and why we are so much a big fan of hers here on this show. I want to look at one other aspect, because we're going to shift actually to Syria here in just a second. But I want to look at one thing that we haven't talked much about the Russian reaction to this so far. Let's see. Dmitry Medvedev actually came out and said, listen, there is going to be a response to this. Those who killed Kirillov. And he specifically says, we need to do everything to destroy the customers who are in Kiev. These customers are known. This is the military political leadership of Ukraine. Now, Medvedev is well known and famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, for saying lots of hyperbolic things, etc., many of which don't come true. But he's also talked about many things that have come to pass. Do you think that Putin, as restrained as he's been in some areas, will allow this assassination in the capital, not far from the Kremlin, to go without response? And if not, what do you think may come from Russia?
I can't predict what the response will be, only that there will undoubtedly be a response. This is not going to pass unnoticed or unpunished, particularly at this point in time when Ukraine is weaker than it's ever been. In fact, I don't know that the Ukrainian nation state per se even exists anymore. The military is fragmented and disintegrated. So I'm sure something will be done. I can't predict it. But again, you've got to be careful. Medvedev has always been, as you say, very hyperbolic. Remember that President Putin, as the head of state of Russia, must first and foremost think of what's in Russia's larger interest. He's done very well in that capacity, in my judgment, because he's kept Russia out of a major conflict with us, and for that matter, with NATO. He's avoided it. I think he wants to continue to avoid it, as any sane person would. Hopefully, when President Trump takes the reins of power, he will be able to cooperate with Putin in avoiding that collision that would be catastrophic for all of us.
Certainly, we hope that's the case. But he's not in power yet. And so we still have some head-scratching, eye-opening kinds of actions from the current administration. And one of the key areas is in regard to U.S. troops in Syria. Now, of course, obviously, the Syrian regime has fallen. There's all kinds of chaos in there. You have, groups that we currently identify as a al-Qaeda-based terrorist organization. The guy Jolani, who's leading the HTS, still has a $10 million bounty on his head. You have Turkey doing some things in the north, Turkey-backed groups against the SDF, Israel in the south moving in and taking territory, et cetera, all kinds of chaos in there. Now, as we've been arguing, this is a golden opportunity to finally get our troops out of Syria and get them out of harm's way, because there's no value to our country to leaving them there, or so I argue. But apparently Matt Miller yesterday seems to be talking about sending more in.
We continue to look at when the right time may be to get American personnel into Syria. But when we do that, just let me finish. When we do that, we have to make sure that we can do it in a secure way. And when the United States makes a move like this, it matters. It's something that's watched by the entire world. So we want to make sure we go in at the appropriate time. We want to make sure we do it in a way that's secure. We want to make sure we do it in a way that meets the other missions that we need to answer when we go into Syria. We're working through all of those issues now.
Now, one thing that the administration said early on after Assad fell was that they wanted to beef up force protection in this, among the troops that are in Syria. Apparently, that didn't mean just more, air defense weapons or whatever, but more troops. Do you have any knowledge about what he's talking about?
Well, first of all, no, I'm not on the inside of this administration, and I'm not in a position to give you any specifics of what's under consideration. What we can say is the following. We have to be very careful right now. Syria as a country no longer exists. In fact, I would regard Syria as more a region, much like Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's not a country. It's got many different people in it. It was always held together by a strong figure of some kind. And that figure, whoever it was, has always been controversial from the time that the great Salahuddin was in Damascus until now. So it's a place that it no longer exists except on paper or perhaps in the minds of people in Washington. What you're seeing now is a land grab, not just by the Israelis, by the Turks. And I think the CIA, MI6, and so forth are trying to hold their respective jihadist organizations in readiness to do the bidding of Washington and Jerusalem. But that's going to become increasingly difficult. The Turks are now building up for what obviously will become an offensive against the Kurds in northeastern Syria, because that has become the sort of core element of a Kurdish state in the future. And that's something that is unacceptable to the Turks and has been since they warned us not to do stupid things in 1990 and 91. So that's off the table. The other thing is that the Israelis have already moved in. They have a so-called buffer zone, which is now being condemned by various people. And they're taking over territory which they have every intention of colonizing. This is what happens when a state is fragile and it really cannot defend itself. And now the great powers that are involved in this, Russia, the United States, Iran, have decided to do different things. The Iranians have pulled back, viewing this as a lost cause. The Russians decided after their investment that it doesn't make any sense anymore. And they have options to go elsewhere if they want another base in the Mediterranean. There are others who will welcome a Russian presence. So they've decided to leave. Now what's next? Well, we have joint Turkish-Israeli hegemony, at least at the moment. But that too, in and of itself, is very fragile. You know, one of the things that happened recently that nobody paid attention to, and everybody needs to think about this, is that the Turkish intelligence chief flew to Damascus a few days ago, and he landed at the airport, and then he was driven immediately to the Umayyad mosque in Damascus. And there he prayed. And after praying, he then went on to meet with various representatives of the jihadist groups and I'm sure the intelligence agencies. Now, why would he go to the Umayyad mosque? Because that represented the caliphate between roughly 860 and 950. That Damascus at that point was an Islamic capital of enormous importance inside the Islamic world. Remember, that too was Salahuddin's capital. And it was a capital several times in the future for various reasons. The Turks are sending a message, and he sent a message by worshiping in that mosque. His message was clear. The empire is back. And by empire, we mean the Turkish Empire. The Turks are now going to move to consolidate control over as much of Syria as they deem necessary. They will back these Sunni Islamists, these jihadists, and incidentally, they're helping these jihadists now destroy already Kurdish and Arab elements in northeast Syria that are obviously sponsored by us. So we're headed into more killing, more conflict. What we've done is, instead of preserving this ridiculously phony post-liberal world order or rules-based world order, we've created chaos. The chaos will continue.
And keeping on that term or on that theme in the region, you have recently published a piece in the American Conservative titled "Iran: America's Next War of Choice." And I want to go into some specific things that you said in there, but I want to kind of set it up because I think that probably supporting some of your contentions is something that Benjamin Netanyahu just said.
מזכ"ל חיזבאללה, נעים קאסם, אמר את זה אתמול בפה מלא. ציטוט: חיזבאללה איבד את נתיב האספקה הצבאי דרך סוריה. והדברים האלה הם כמובן עדות נוספת לפגיעה הקשה שהסבנו לציר האיראני כולו. אבל עם זאת אני מבקש גם להעביר וגם להזהיר. אנחנו מחויבים למנוע גם התחמשות מחודשת של חיזבאללה, וזה מבחן מתמשך עבור ישראל. עלינו לעמוד בו, ואנחנו נעמוד בו. אני אומר לחיזבאללה ולאיראן בצורה שאינה משתמעת לשני פנים, כדי למנוע מכם לפגוע בנו, אנחנו נמשיך לפעול נגדכם ככל שנדרש, בכל זירה ובכל זמן. על כל זה שוחחתי אמש שוב עם ידידי נשיא ארצות הברית הנבחר דונלד טראמפ. זו הייתה שיחה מאוד ידידותית, מאוד חמה ומאוד חשובה. דיברנו על הצורך להשלים את ניצחון ישראל.
Now, in this article, you wrote that you believed that it was Netanyahu's top priority to destroy Iran before Trump comes in. Do you still hold to that?
Yeah, I think so. There are a couple of reasons that Netanyahu in particular, but the Israelis collectively will want to move sooner rather than later. There is always a danger with Donald Trump, and I mean this in a good way, that Donald Trump comes into office, surveys the territory, and really have to destroy these people. We can cut a deal with these people. And I mean that. That's the way Donald Trump thinks. He's very transactional in so many ways. Instead of fighting, we can do X, Y, and Z. The Israelis are not really interested in any deals unless the deal confers on them complete and total victory over whomever they dislike at the moment. So that means he's talking about Hezbollah, he's talking about Syria, he's talking about the Arab populations inside Israel and potentially expanding beyond that into Jordan and Egypt. So he's not terribly interested in deals unless it gives him something that justifies a pause from which he can then move further in the future. Donald Trump is not interested in that. Donald Trump is not someone who is seeking confrontation with anyone. That's why I think there are a number of neocons who are worried that he's simply going to say, we've made terrible mistakes in Ukraine. We've got to get out of this. And I'm going to sign off on neutrality, and I'm going to sign off on getting us out and let the Ukrainians and the Europeans sit down with the Russians and sort out the borders. I think he's afraid. There are many people in Washington afraid he's going to do that, but that would be the smart move. And I think Donald Trump is a good businessman, understands there are times when you cut your losses, and Ukraine is clearly one of those. Then we move to the Middle East, and he knows the stakes are high. Maybe he doesn't know how high, but he knows they're high. Russia, as you pointed out earlier, has withdrawn or is in the process of withdrawing from Syria. They're going to give up these ports and move out. But that doesn't mean that Russia will abandon Iran. On the contrary, if Israel strikes Iran, they will find Russia standing next to Iran. And striking Iran without us is a really tough nut to crack because their air and missile defense systems are very good, and they can identify aircraft and incoming missiles and shoot them down. So I think he will go first and foremost when he thinks he's consolidated his position in Syria against Iran, because Iran is the ticket to bringing us into the war directly. Now, clearly, nothing that has happened on the Israeli side could have happened without us. You can look at the vast stores of munitions, our intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, the weapon systems, obviously. But Iran is different. These people are not Arab states subsisting exclusively on oil with teeming populations that are unhappy. He's dealing with what I would call perhaps the most modern nation state in the region, and that's Iran. And I think President Trump will look at Iran as a place where he too could cut a deal. I don't think that's something that Mr. Netanyahu wants. So if you don't want a deal, you attack Iran. And then when Iran responds dramatically and decisively, which it will, that's when you call upon the United States to say, please, please come in and help us. And we will. And
one of the objectives that the U.S. has claimed for decades is that we want to, quote, prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And so all these actions, whether it was Obama trying the JCPOA or Trump's getting out of the JCPOA and saying we want a better deal, because he did say he didn't just get out, he claimed he wanted to negotiate a better deal, et cetera. But now then, especially with Israel taking out Hamas, devastating Hezbollah, weakening further the Houthis, and then now all of a sudden emasculating Syria after Assad fell. They launched 800, was the last number I saw, airstrikes to just destroy everything military related with inside Syria. So now then, Iran is much more vulnerable, especially on the south. And there's concern that the IAEA has reported that the amount of fissile material being processed is continuing to expand, and giving indication that Iran may make the political decision to finally go after a bomb, the thing we say we wouldn't want to do. In this environment, do you see, or how do you see the risk that Iran may take that step to defend itself?
Israel has enjoyed a monopoly on nuclear weapons for decades. We initially, under President John F. Kennedy, were reluctant to provide them with the assistance and support to build a nuclear weapon. Ultimately, it came from the French. But they've had that, and that has made a difference. If you go back to as recently as the 73 war, the Egyptians and others carefully considered the wisdom of trying to invade Israel. Now, the Egyptians never got there. They never got to the across the Sinai. But then again, the Egyptians really weren't interested in invading Israel. But had they been, there wasn't a whole lot to stop them initially after they crossed the canal. Israel's possession of nuclear weapons never left the mind of Sadat. He mentions that in his memoirs. He said that to his generals. Do not ignore that reality. They have got a nuclear weapon. Israel fears very much the possibility that not only Iran, but also the Turks could have a nuclear weapon. Both of them can get nuclear weapons quickly. And the Turks have made it very clear that if Iran becomes a nuclear armed power, they will become a nuclear armed power too. And they've always made it very clear that they would have help and assistance in this from Pakistan. Now, the question is, how do you prevent the Iranians from going nuclear? I don't see how you do it at this point. Put yourself in the shoes of the Iranian leadership. What is the incentive to remain naked and unprotected in the face of Israeli nuclear power? I mean, the Israelis have made it pretty clear that you are a subhuman, you are Amalek, you deserve the worst. And the Israelis are just as intent on destroying the Iranians as they are on destroying the Arabs. And frankly, anybody that stands in their way, let's be frank, that's where it is right now. What would you do? Well, if you're an Iranian, you would probably invest in a nuclear weapon. And I'm quite confident that they're well on the way to it. They have always had the expertise, but they haven't done it. Now, once they've got it, and you try to destroy these facilities, which I don't think we'll be able to do, but who knows? The facilities are distributed. They're not all concentrated in one area. And they are underground. But if you do it, you try to destroy it, that will actually reinforce the mindset in Iran that, you know, we have to have this to preserve ourselves, because if we don't have it, the next thing that comes our way is a nuclear weapon.
Now, you also wrote in this piece, wasn't all bad news. You say that if it's handled deftly, that there is a way to successfully manage the chaos, is the phrase that you used, and to avoid conflict. How can Trump come in the event that he gets a chance, i.e. that Netanyahu doesn't launch something prior to January 20th, but if he gets in and there hasn't been a war, how can Trump manage the chaos to prevent war and manage Netanyahu?
I think it should be clear right now that we continue to have enormous influence with the Israelis. Whether or not Donald Trump will exercise that influence by simply saying, we would like you to stop where you are as opposed to continuing, I don't know. I mean, I just don't know the answer to that. Looking at his cabinet and where things are at the moment with the Trump team, it strikes me that he would have a great deal of difficulty trying to say no to the Israelis. On the other side, what kind of influence is he going to have on the Turks? Well, I think he's a realist. He's going to say Syria has always been a problem for the Turks. And if the Turks want to go in and essentially drive the Kurds out or give the Kurds a chance to become part of the new territorial solution, whatever that turns out to be, that will effectively make Syria a satellite state of Greater Turkey, then that might be fine with him. I think Donald Trump knows that neither you nor I nor anybody in the United States wants to be involved in another Middle Eastern war. All of these wars have turned out to be catastrophes for us. How many trillions of dollars have we lost on these propositions? What have we gained from it? I mean, I remember President Trump said, well, we got the oil in northeastern Syria. That oil is a drop in the bucket from our standpoint, but it was important to the Israelis. There are other things going on. The potential to divert the flow of oil through Turkey or through Israel into Europe, which I'm sure Donald Trump would favor. On the other hand, there's still a lot of pressure to move it straight north through Iran all the way up into Russia. I don't know how he's going to go forward to try and divide this child, but those issues will be on the table. He understands those things, and he'll try to sort through it. But the bottom line is, right now, to get back to the core question, if you want to manage this, you have to recognize legitimate security interests. The Turks have legitimate security interests. The Israelis have legitimate security interests. The Iranians have legitimate security interests. What are our interests? And suddenly everything's silent. Because quite frankly, as long as the oil flows commercially in whatever particular direction it takes, we as a great power remote from the region should be happy. I mean, that's always been our view. The reason we maintain such a large Navy for so many decades is to ensure that commerce flows uninterrupted. So what is our interest? Well, our interest is Israel. And the Israelis want to control territory and they want to colonize it. And we're going to back them on that score. And if the Turks go along with that and the Iranians go along with it, then perhaps you can reach some sort of arrangement that will work. But barring that, barring the acceptance of Israel within a new set of borders with the promise of no further expansion, I think the war goes on.
And let me ask you in the last few minutes we have here, how you see the medium and long term for Israel, because if you're looking at the near term, without any question, militarily, Israel has substantially defeated or diminished, if not destroyed, Hamas, Hezbollah, degraded the Houthis, and obviously wiped out Syria, etc. So the security environment has been enormously tactically successful for Israel. But I argue that they are built planting seeds for long-term instability because of the damage here. Because right now, at least as we're talking, the issue of the Palestinian people has still not been resolved. They haven't gotten them out, but they also have destroyed any ability for them to live any kind of a life for the foreseeable future in there. So how do you see the middle and long-term security issues for Israel?
Well, if you're an Israeli right now, you look at what's being done in Gaza and what is beginning to happen on a smaller scale in the West Bank, and you say no one in the region cares about Arab life. Whether those Arabs or Muslims or Christians, it doesn't matter. Nobody really cares. That's been demonstrated in their minds very conclusively. None of the Arab states in the region will raise a hand against them. The only potential adversaries they've got are Turks and Persians or Iranians. So in that sense, they see this as a big success, and they will continue to murder or expel Arabs from Gaza. They will do the same thing, the Palestinian Arabs. They will do the same thing to the Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank. That's going to go on and on and on. The question is, what do the Turks do and what do the Iranians do? They don't love each other. That's obvious. They have disputes, but they also have avoided going to war with each other. Neither side wants to go to war and then ruin themselves in the face of Israeli power. So the question is, how much longer does this new territorial arrangement in Syria last until the Turks decide they've changed their minds? They're fed up and they're not going to tolerate what the Israelis are doing. I can't answer that question. But I think it's a long-term strategic challenge that they have to meet. Same thing is true with Iran, although Iran's threat to Israel has always been different from the Turkish threat. The Iranians aren't interested in the territory. They have stood by the Palestinian state issue. That's now dead on arrival. There's no chance whatsoever in the foreseeable future of a Palestinian Arab state emerging in the region. It's not there. And again, to reiterate, the Saudis, the Emirates, the Egyptians, the Jordanians all don't care. Whatever lip service they pay to it, they've already demonstrated. We don't care how many people the Israelis kill to expand control of their state. You know, back in 1871, when the Franco-Prussian War ended, Bismarck fought against the acquisition of Alsace-Lorraine. He admitted that the Alsatians in the northern part of Alsace-Lorraine really were Germans, and they were not comfortable being Frenchmen. But he pointed out that Lorraine had long since been lost and had become truly French. He said, let's just leave it alone. We don't want it. Ultimately, he was overruled, and the statement was made by him subsequently, what our sword has won in 50 days, we will have to defend for 50 years. And eventually, in less than 50 years, you got 1914, and 1914 was about reacquiring Alsace-Lorraine by France, if nothing else. So I'm afraid that whatever happens now cannot be legitimated exclusively through power. Power legitimates for a while, but it's not the permanent solution to anything unless you maintain your military supremacy to such an extent that the enemy won't take you on. That did not work for Germany, and I don't think it'll work for the Israelis. But for the moment, if you're an Israeli looking across the Middle East, you see that the face of the Middle East has changed, exactly as Mr. Netanyahu has said. And you're celebrating, and you're planning for a bright and brilliant future. But I'm sure there are very smart people in the Israeli Defense Force General Staff who are looking at these threats and problems very carefully.
Yep, and we'll have to leave it there for the moment. But there's so many things that, I mean, gosh, the world could change again pretty dramatically after January 20th on a number of fronts, and we'll be right here to try and piece that together and figure it out. Thank you very much for coming on today, Doug, and providing us with this great insight on all these issues. Appreciate it.
Merry Christmas to you and everybody, and a Happy New Year.
Same to you, and to your family as well.
Right. Bye-bye.
And we appreciate you guys. Always grateful to have you here. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't. If you're new to the channel, we value you greatly. We'd love you to hit that like and subscribe button so you can keep getting great stuff on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. Thank you very much. We'll look forward to seeing you on the very next episode.